Dr. Since Dr. Gifford already introduced the question, I am just going to move on to my outline. So today I'm going to go over, first off, the impacts of aging on exercise tolerance. And then I'll talk about different ways to measure exercise tolerance. And then we'll talk about critical power. This is one of the ways that you can measure exercise tolerance. And then we'll talk about how aging affects critical power. And after that, we'll go into my research questions and my methods. So to start off, what is the impact of aging on exercise tolerance? So as Gifford was mentioning, they took some data from the World Masters Championships and they published it. So this is Gifford and Collins. So what they did is this World Masters Championships is where people of all ages come and compete in different events. So for the figure that I have on the left, they looked at different race distances. So like the 60 meters, the 400 meter, 800 meter, and so on. And then they also looked at the race speed for 3 different age groups. So they looked at 35-year-olds, 55-year-olds, and 75-year-olds. So the black circles are the 35-year-old group. The dark gray circles are the 55-year-old group, and the light gray circles are the 75-year-old group. So you can see from the graph that even in these elite athletes, aging significantly decreases speed or exercise tolerance. So how do you measure exercise tolerance? So there are a few different ways that have been around to measure these exercise tolerance. The first one is lactate threshold. So lactate threshold is an accumulation of lactate in the blood, and it occurs when you have more lactate entering the blood than you can use. So this isn't a great definition of exercise tolerance because when you are exercising above lactate threshold, you can still exercise for a pretty significant amount of time. Another way to measure exercise tolerance is VO2 max. So this is when you hook someone up to a VO2 max test and you have them exercise to their max capacity. So this isn't a great measure of exercise tolerance either because it is a maximum test. You can exercise below your VO2 max and still fatigue relatively quickly. So then there is critical power. So critical power is, by definition, it's this separation between compensable and uncompensable exercise. So compensable means that it can be compensated for. So when you exercise, metabolites build up and other side effects of exercise and metabolism. And if you fatigue within a certain amount of time, the body can't compensate for those metabolites, right? But when you're exercising below critical power, the body can compensate for those, so you can exercise for a long amount of time. So on this slide, there is a figure of 2 subjects where we tested critical power doing knee extension exercise. So the picture on the right is a picture of our knee extension machine. It's hooked up to a bike and we have the subject kick out and we can change the wattage depending on how intense we need the exercise to be. So in this graph, you can see that the X-axis is wattage, and the Y-axis is the number of minutes that could be sustained. And we have two subjects. We've got our untrained and our trained subject, and our critical power lines for both of them. You can see when exercising above critical power, so each of these points is a exercise that they performed, they fatigue relatively quickly. But when exercising below critical power, they could exercise for 50 minutes. We actually cut it off at 50 minutes, so they might have been able to maintain it for longer. So as I mentioned before, that metabolites cause this fatigue. That plays into this study done by Jones. So in this study, they measured some of these metabolites that influence this fatigue. And the three that they looked at were the pH level, the inorganic phosphates, and the phosphocreatine. Okay, so in this study, they did knee extension exercise, as in the picture before, in a similar fashion. And they looked at critical power, or an exercise 10% above critical power and exercise 10% below critical power. So our black circles are below critical power and our white circles are above critical power. In all three of these graphs, you can see, that all of these metabolites reach a steady state. They kind of level off after a certain amount of time. And that shows that the exercise is compensable. The body is able to handle that amount of metabolite buildup. But when exercising above critical power, there isn't really a steady state. The metabolite buildup occurs until failure on all three of them. Okay, so let's talk a little bit more about critical power. So to understand critical power, it's really important to understand the pathway of oxygen and aerobic metabolism. So I'm going to use this picture on the right to kind of go through the different areas that could influence critical power. So the first one that we see is in the lungs. So when you breathe in, oxygen comes into the body. And can you guys hear me? Sorry, I froze on the screen, so I wanted to make sure. Okay. So oxygen comes into the lungs and diffuses through the alveoli into the blood. So with patients that have COPD, we see a decrease in this oxygen that comes into the blood because there is a decreased surface area. So this would influence that pathway of oxygen, ultimately influencing critical power. Another area that we can see this happen, I'm so sorry, that was the cats. Okay, so another area that we can see that would affect or influence critical power is the heart. So the heart pumps blood through the body, and if let's say there's a patient that has heart failure, the heart isn't going to be able to get that blood through the body, allowing the oxygen to be transported to the muscles that need it. And this would also affect critical power. It would decrease it. Another area that we see that influences critical power is where the arteries direct the blood. So right here, we can see that endothelial function or vascular function has a big play in where the blood is transported. So if someone had atherosclerosis or just endothelial damage, the arteries wouldn't be able to vasodilate as effectively, which could cause the blood to be transported to the body evenly as opposed to where the body needs the oxygen to exercise. Another area where we see that influences critical power is the capillary density around the muscles. So as you increase the capillaries around the muscles, you increase the surface area that oxygen can diffuse through, and you can increase that oxygen that gets to the muscle. And then the last one we see is the mitochondria. So as oxygen is transported from the blood to the muscle, it will get transported to the mitochondria where it can go through, and it will help in aerobic metabolism, which ultimately produces ATP, allowing the muscle to contract or exercise. So in a study done by Kirby, it came out this year, and it was done actually at Nike, which I think is pretty cool. They looked at oxygen saturation in the muscle. So they used this equation on the right to determine that percentage of oxygen saturation. And they had subjects perform knee extension. So there's kind of a picture of our knee extension machine up here. And the way that they measured this oxygenated hemoglobin and total amount of hemoglobin was by a NIRS. A NIRS stands for near infrared spectroscopy. And it is this black line. These are the wires that come up, and then we cover it so that the red light that comes through the probe isn't influenced by outside light, and the light will penetrate the muscle, and it will help us determine the oxygenated hemoglobin and the total amount of hemoglobin. So in this study, they had subjects perform exercise, this knee extension exercise, at 3 different intensities. They had them do severe, heavy, and moderate intensity. In this case, heavy and moderate intensity are both below critical power, and severe is above critical power. In this figure, the time that they exercised is on the x-axis, and then the percent saturation of the muscle is on the y-axis. So you can see at the start of exercise that all 3 of the intensities cause a decrease in muscle oxygen saturation pretty rapidly. But then our moderate intensity starts to recover, and it looks to reach a steady state. And we see a similar thing with our heavy intensity. It starts to increase some more until it reaches more of a steady state. And the severe intensity decreases the oxygen saturation until fatigue. There is no recovery for that. So this shows that the availability of oxygen is really important in critical power. Okay, so let's talk about how aging affects critical power. So does critical power even go down with aging? So again, back to this World Masters Championship study that Gifford and Collins did. They took the data from the participants in this championship, and they determined what their critical speed was at different ages. And then they plotted it. So you can see that even in these elite athletes, that critical power or critical speed decreases with aging. Even when you are on the top of your game, you still have that decrease. So what effects does aging have on this oxygen delivery? So I'm going to talk about 4 different influences of aging. So what is the impact of aging on exercise blood flow? In this study done by Nyberg, they also performed knee extension exercise in young sedentary, old sedentary, and old active, excuse me. So they had them perform knee extension exercise while using a Doppler ultrasound to scan the femoral artery. And then they measured their blood flow during rest, during 12 watts, and during 45% of their max wattage. So in this study, the young sedentary are our gray bars, the old sedentary are the black bars, and the old active are our white bars. And then the bars that have the lines going through them are the control group, or not the control group, they're the test group. So what they did is they increased the bioavailability of nitric oxide, and then that would account for all of the bars that have lines through them, and the control group are the solid bars. So when looking at the leg blood flow in milliliters per minute, they saw that when exercising at 12 watts, there is a decrease in the old sedentary and old active. So that means that there is an increase, or there's a higher blood flow in our young sedentary subjects. And then when exercising at 45% of their max wattage, we see that there is a decrease between our young sedentary and our old sedentary, but there's also a change in our old sedentary and our old active. As you can see from the graph, our young sedentary and our old active are pretty similar. So that would show us that being active is also very important. The next one. Okay, so what is the impact of aging on time to increase blood flow? So another way to say that is, how long does it take them to reach steady state? So in a study done by Chillibeck, they had different subjects perform VO2 max tests. In this case, they actually just performed VO2 tests. So they exercised below their maximum. And there's a picture of that on the right. In this study specifically, they looked at our young and old subjects. So our A and B graph are the young subjects, and our C and D graph are the old subjects. And then our A and C graph are at the start of exercise, and our B and D graph are at the end of exercise. So the y-axis is the oxygen consumption in liters per minute, and then the x-axis is the time. So when looking at our VO2 of our young subjects, you see an increase in the VO2 at the start of exercise. So right about here, you see a rapid increase, and then you see that they reach a steady state. In our old subjects, you see an increase in oxygen consumption, but it's not quite as rapid, and it takes them longer to reach that steady state level. They have similar effects in the recovery. So our young subjects have a quicker recovery time and reach steady state faster. When our old subjects, it takes them a little bit longer to come back down to this steady state level. So this shows us that with aging, it takes longer for older people to reach a steady state than it does for our younger people. Okay, so what could be affecting this? So we have, what is the impact of aging on vascular function? So there's studies that determine vascular function by performing PLM. So there's a picture of PLM done on the right side. So what happens is we have the subject in a relaxed state while one researcher scans the femoral artery, and another researcher moves the leg from 180 degrees to 90 degrees and back to 180 degrees once every second for 60 seconds. So in a study by Brocksterman, they performed PLM, and that is our control group is the black circles here. And then they also performed PLM when they inhibited nitric oxide. So that is our white circles or the clear circles right here. So you can see that at the start of PLM, you have an increase in blood flow, and blood flow is measured in milliliters per minute. So we have an increase until we reach the peak, and then it comes back down almost to a resting level. And when nitric oxide is inhibited, we still have that peak, but it doesn't go nearly as high, and it comes back down a lot quicker. In this study, they also looked at single PLM or SPLM, and this is when the researcher moves the subject's leg from 180 to 90 degrees and back to 180 one time. And then the researcher scanning the femoral artery will measure the blood flow. So that is this image on the left. So here we can see that even in a single movement, there is still an increase in blood flow, and we still reach a peak of this blood flow, and then it comes back down to almost a resting level. And when you inhibit nitric oxide, it again peaks, but not nearly as much, and then comes back down. So they determined that both PLM and single PLM are valid measurements of vascular function. So then to follow up on that study, Hydrin did a study looking at blood flow in young and old subjects. So our x-axis here is seconds, and then our y-axis is blood flow in milliliters per minute. And then our black circles here, or our black bar, is our young subjects. And then the white or clear circles, open circles, are the old subjects. So you can see that during PLM, their young subjects reach a much higher peak blood flow than our old subjects. So this would tell us that vascular function is severely inhibited in our older subjects. Okay, and then our last one is, what is the impact of aging on muscle mass? So in a study done by Netter in 1999, they looked at the leg strength and leg muscle mass over aging years. So you can see on the graph, we have from year 20 to year 80, and then they have leg strength over leg muscle mass. And you can see that in both of these, they decrease pretty significantly. So this would show us that with aging, you decrease in muscle mass, which is pretty, I would say, pretty inherent. We've seen that. But to follow up on that study, Proctor in 1997 did a study comparing leg muscle mass and VO2 max when controlling for that leg muscle mass. So in this study, our black circles are the young men and our black squares are the young women. And then our white circles are the older men and our white squares are the older women. So you can see from this that even when controlling for muscle mass, VO2 max still seems to be down with aging. Okay, so let's talk about my research questions. What do we want to learn? So my first question is, does critical power decrease with aging when controlling for muscle mass? And my second question is Is muscle blood flow lower in older adults than younger adults during submaximal and maximal exercise? And are age-related decreases in blood flow related to critical power? So let's talk about the methods, how we're going to answer these questions. So this is a brief overview of what my methods are going to be, and I'll discuss that in a minute. But before we get there, let's talk about our subjects. So this is a picture of me and my little sister and my parents, because they are older. Okay, so for our subjects, we are looking for our young subjects to be between the ages of 18 and 35. And then our old subjects, we're looking for them to be 60 years old or older. We're hoping to get 15 in each group. This will be a large enough group to have an effective power. And then we want healthy individuals with no cardiorespiratory issues or cardiovascular medications so that there won't be effects on the blood flow. And then we're going to match our young and our old subjects by their self-reported activity levels, and then confirm those self-reported activity levels with accelerometer data. So to answer my first question, does critical power decrease with aging when controlling for muscle mass? We will do our visits 1 through 4. So on a visit 1, we will have our subjects come in and we will consent them. And then we will do a DEXA scan as well as thigh measurements to determine the muscle mass of the quad. After that, we will have them do a graded exercise test in the knee extension to help with some familiarization. It takes a little bit to get used to. It's kind of an interesting exercise. And then at the end of the day, we will send them out with an accelerometer, which we will collect later. And then on visits 2 through 4, we will perform critical power tests. So to perform our critical power test, we will pick a percentage that is about 85% or higher based off of their graded exercise test done on the familiarization day. And we'll have them do a warm up at 40% of their knee extension max that they did on the familiarization day. And then they will rest for 5 minutes and then do another warm up at that same 40% for 3 minutes. And then we will increase the wattage to a certain percent or a certain wattage and have them exercise until fatigue. And then we will plot the time and the percentage to help us determine critical power. On visit 4 at the end, we will have this subject perform one more GXT max, or this graded exercise test max. This is just to verify that we have an accurate max wattage for each subject. So from this, we'll be able to determine if critical power decreases with aging when controlling for that muscle mass. Okay, so then to answer my second question, is muscle blood flow lower in older adults than younger during submaximal and maximal exercise? We are going to first perform single PLM on our subjects at the very beginning of visit 5. So just to remind you of what that is, I have a picture of it up here on the top. So we will have the subject do that, and then we will hook the subject into our knee extension machine, and we will have a researcher move their leg for them in the machine for 3 minutes. And then at exactly 3 minutes, we have the subject start to kick so that there's contraction at 10 watts for 5 minutes. And then at the end of the 5 minutes, we increase the wattage to 20 watts and have the subject continue kicking for another 5 minutes. During this test, we will have a researcher scan the femoral artery so that we can see the changes in blood flow and that measure, so we can measure the time to increase blood flow or to that steady state. At the end of that exercise, we will perform a finger prick and measure our hemoglobin concentration of each subject so we can compare that between our young and our old. And then at the end of the rest period, we will have the subject do a warm up at 40% of their critical power for 3 minutes. And then we will increase the wattage to 90% of their critical power and have them exercise for 15 minutes. During this test, we will also have a researcher be scanning the femoral artery. And this will allow us to, again, look at that increased time or that time to increase blood flow. Between these two tests, so this first one and this second one, we'll be able to look at a absolute comparing the young and the old. And then we'll also be able to look at a relative comparing the young and the old. And this will allow us to understand the blood flow at submaximal exercise. So then at the very end of that test 2, we will have them again rest for a few minutes, and then we will do some maximal exercise testing. So we'll have the subject warm up again at 40% of their critical power for 3 minutes, and then we will increase the wattage to whatever their max wattage was, and we will have them exercise until fatigue. After they fatigue, we'll have them continue to kick, but we will lower the wattage to that 40% of their critical power for 3 minutes again. And then we will increase the wattage one last time to their max and have them exercise to fatigue. At the very end of all of the testing, we will put a blood pressure cuff on the upper thigh, and we will calibrate the nurse so that it is calibrated to each individual. During all of the testing, except for our single PLM, the subject will have a nurse placed on their vastus lateralis so that we can look at the hemoglobin and oxygen saturation. Okay, and then to answer my last question, are age-related decreases in blood flow related to critical power? So to do this, we will look at our blood flow from our different tests on visit 5 and compare them to our critical power test done on visits 2 through 4. And then lastly, so to analyze these questions, for our first question, we will do an independent t-test of critical power and then divide it by muscle mass to control for that muscle mass. For the second question, we'll do an independent t-test of blood flow. And then for the last question, we will do a Parsons correlation. And that is it. Are there any questions?
All right, well, good job, Abby.
Thanks.
Let's open it up for questions. Anyone who is here is eligible to ask a question.
So good job, Abby. I have a question about, so you showed some data with the measurement of vascular function using L-name. And you're assessing vascular function using the passive leg movement exercise, right? Because it didn't seem to be that important for the other study you showed. I forgot the author. But you're not proposing to use L-name. So explain to me how you're evaluating differences in vascular function Whereas
Yeah.
they use this, they're isolating the NO dependent pathways by using an NO inhibitor.
Yeah. Mhm. So in the study done by Broxterman, they did this in the same age group. So what they did is they had the control and then the L-name inhibitor, but we're going to be looking at basically the control of this for both old and young. So in this study by Hydron, you can see that there's an increase in peak blood flow in our younger subjects than our old subjects. So even when doing PLM just as a control, that allows us to see that vascular function, right? Because when you add the L name, it inhibits that nitric oxide availability. And so that is part of the vascular function, right? If you have good vascular health, you'll have an increase in that nitric oxide. And we see that decrease in vascular function in aging. They aren't as susceptible, or what's the right word? They aren't as sensitive to nitric oxide because of their decreased vascular function.
With the passive leg movement test, right? Because the other study showed Nyberg, and I could be interpreting what you showed wrong, but it seemed to me that with it really, the NO dependent pathway wasn't really the issue. Am I interpreting that incorrectly? Because when they did, so the vascular function, I mean, I'm equating those two, and maybe I shouldn't be. Does that make sense what I'm asking? So this is during exercise, right?
Yeah, so this is during exercise.
Which is different than the passive leg movement.
Yes. Yeah. So during exercise, you tend to see that increase in nitric oxide naturally, right? In subjects or in humans, I guess. So in this study, they were looking at I guess I'm not quite sure what your question is.
So you're,
Something. So
go ahead.
the NAC condition, that's N-acetylcysteine.
Mhm.
So it's a powerful antioxidant. And so it's not an NO inhibitor, it's not an NO donor. They're hoping that it would increase NO bioavailability. But in terms of like our study, the NAC, the NAC condition isn't terribly relevant.
Great. Yeah, that helps.
Yeah.
Yeah, I, for some reason, as we glossed past this, I was equating the L name with this study too, but it's a different method.
Yes. Yeah.
So you're assuming, so if this study was done with L name,
Mhm.
you would hypothesize a similar effect to your passive leg movement. Am I correct in that or not?
Yeah. So if we were to look at our young sedentary with the control group, we would see a higher blood flow, a higher leg blood flow than if their young sedentary had the L name added to it.
Okay.
But we would also see a difference between the young sedentary and the old sedentary, even just in the control, which is what we're looking at.
Okay.
Right. So this young sedentary has higher blood flow than the old sedentary.
And you expect there's be depression in the vascular function aspect of it with aging.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Hey, Abby, how do you think the vascular function? Is there any data that look kind of like this, where you're comparing a young sedentary and an older sedentary versus older active with just vascular function? So using like passive leg movement or the flow mediated dilation or something, where does it look the same? Whereas if you're a really active older person, you don't lose vascular function?
Yeah. So this is I think kind of answering your question here. So in this one, they had young and old of the same activity level.
Low or
For
high?
I'm trying to remember off the top of my head.
These were like recreationally active.
That's what I was gonna say. Yeah.
Recreationally active. It's always kind of vague, isn't it? Right.
Yeah.
But if you have like highly active, we did some studies. If you have some like masters athletes, 70-year-olds, they're better off than their sedentary counterparts, but they're still not as good as the sedentary young. So there's still this age effect, and then they're way worse than the active young.
Okay.
So unfortunately, you can't prevent the complete decline.
Okay. But it seems that at least at the higher intensity exercise in the other study, you can, with activity, they looked exactly the same as the sedentary young people.
So I would argue that this isn't at a very high intensity because it's only 45% of their max.
Okay.
But
I guess
yeah.
I meant higher intensity.
Yeah, well, because for some of those old people, that 45% could be lower than this 12 watts.
And the problem with that is the old and sedentary and active will have very different maxes. So they're all doing different workloads here. So some of them could be going at 20 watts, the sedentary are probably at 10 watts, the old active are probably like 25 watts. And so it's not a very fair comparison on that. It's a limitation in a lot of ex-phys research.
Yeah. It's a relative comparison.
All right, I have a question that's slightly, maybe a little bit unrelated to the research, but I'm curious. I probably should know the answer to this question. I'm hoping that you do. But so as it relates to blood flow, I know blood flow is highly dependent on heart rate.
Mm-hmm.
And I know when you get older, as you age, your max heart rate goes down. Right?
Mm-hmm.
We have that equation to calculate max heart rate. But during exercise, like closer, submaximal exercise,
Mm-hmm.
Is the heart rate in older people also significantly lower? So if you match the intensity between a young and an old person?
So I think some of that depends on if they're trained or untrained. If you were
So
looking,
if you match training, let's say you
Uh-huh.
match training and match intensity, would the older person have a lower heart rate?
Okay, let me think about this. So we've got our old active and our young active. As far as I am aware, I don't. I know that with aging, so like if they're unactive, then they will have a higher heart rate because they're trying to compensate for that exercise. But between the young, like if we were looking at young active and old active, I would think that because the young are active, they are able to sustain exercise at a lower heart rate, but that the old, it could be a similar heart rate. Dr. Gifford, do you know the answer?
It's a good question.
Yeah.
The heart rate, I'm not so sure on, but if you slow down the heart rate, you increase filling time. And if they're submaximal, most of the time, cardiac output, it kind of goes back and forth, but cardiac output is what matters more than heart rate. And it's going to be roughly the same if they're the same physical activity level, as far as I know.
Okay. So do you think, would that have a significant impact on their overall exercise blood flow? Just like a lower heart rate at submaximal exercise?
So, sorry.
Sorry, go ahead, Abby. It's your proposal.
So based off of what you were saying, if cardiac output has a bigger effect, that if they have similar cardiac outputs, it wouldn't blood flow or like the amount of blood, the cardiac output wouldn't be a factor, right?
Yeah, if cardiac output stays the same, but if you do something to decrease cardiac output, whether that happens or not with age,
Yeah.
that could impact blood flow. the knee extension exercise is a little robust against that because it's we're getting to maybe 60% of max heart rate, 60% of max cardiac output. So it's even when it's maximum knee extension, because it's just a single muscle group, the heart is
Less
not
involved.
performance.
Mhm.
Okay.
And that's kind of good in our case for if we're looking at critical power, because it's a submaximal thing. And most data show that max cardiac output doesn't really play a role in critical power. It's more of these peripheral things like the vasculature, the mitochondria, the fiber type, that stuff.
So how are you measuring muscle mass? You're doing an MRI? Is that
So
right?
we're doing a DEXA scan, and
Oh,
then
okay.
we're also doing, so on our day one,
That's
we'll
right.
have them do a
Sorry.
DEXA. And then we're also going to do some manual leg measurements. So like I'll measure the length and the width and skin folds.
So would this be correlate pretty well with and I'm revealing my ignorance, but like a treadmill critical power test versus this where you're isolating the quads? So based on those questions that you just kind of went over, what do you think?
The blood flow questions.
Well, not more of Dr. Hildall's questions and about heart rate and cardiac output, and it being less of an issue for the quads if you're isolating it with the knee extension
Yeah.
type of exercise.
So,
Would this,
sorry. So when exercising on a treadmill, you would see an increase in all of those because you're doing more of a full body exercise. And so you would need to, you'd need to get more blood to more muscles. So you'd have to increase your cardiac output.
so how well do you think that would this correlate as well? Or how would it correlate, or would it not correlate?
Okay. I think I see what you're asking. So if we were to do this on a treadmill, I think it would correlate over, but it's also really hard to like measure blood flow during like a running exercise. So but I would imagine that if you accounted for muscle mass and of the whole body, that it would be pretty similar. What do you think, Dr. Gifford?
Yeah, I think it's going to correlate really well, but it hasn't been looked at. Yeah, there haven't been a lot of studies on critical power, and we're basically among the first people doing critical power during this knee extension exercise. But like VO2 max during knee extension versus cycling exercise I've done before, and the correlation is incredibly tight, like an R of 0.9 something. So
awesome, that's great.
But it is a good question. Like, does our model actually apply to real life or not? That's something I'd love to look at.
It would be because you do the rest of your measurements and then just compare critical power for the two different things. So of course you wouldn't do all the measurements in the cycling or treadmill type. Anyway.
Yeah, it'd be cool if we already submitted the IRB, so it might be a hassle, but it'd be cool to see someday, like if this critical power correlates to something like a 6-minute walk test or a gait speed test, which is like a more functional test used in a clinic.
Yeah.
Yeah, but I have a question. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead, Kamal or Nani.
Sorry, I don't know how to change that. It's our name combined. So maybe I missed this, Abby, in your explanation of the population, but so you said you were going to try and match the old and young subjects for muscle mass and activity. Is that right? Are you wondering if that, or I guess I'm just wondering if, I mean, just off the top of my head, I would think maybe an old person that has roughly the same muscle mass as a younger person is going to be more active than that younger person. And I don't know if that, I mean, I would think that that might matter, but I don't know.
Yeah, so I think that probably I would think that that would be accurate. So
Yeah.
we are going to try to control for both of those, right? So that we can match the activity levels. In this case, or I guess in terms of answering this question, we will, so to determine critical power, we'll match the old and the young subjects, and then we'll divide by their muscle mass so that it'll give us a comparable number between the two.
Gotcha. Okay. Gotcha. Thank you.
Yeah, I don't think she's trying to match for muscle mass. That's going to be pretty hard.
Yeah.
But just kind of like getting a relative VO2 max where you put it VO2 divided by body mass. She's going to put critical power divided by muscle mass. But matching physical activity.
Not matching.
Yeah.
Gotcha. Thanks, Abby.
Okay, I got a good one for you, Abby.
Oh, okay.
Here we go. Let's say that Jessica Lindy finds that critical power or menstrual cycle, like stage of the menstrual cycle, is really important in determining the critical power. What does that mean for your study?
So that's actually a really good question. I think I forgot to put that on here, but we are, for our young females, we are going to have them come in between days 1 and 7 of their cycle.
So you're going to match it. What about the older women who are postmenopausal?
So because we're looking at days 1 through 7, I'm pretty sure that that should compare to postmenopausal. Is that correct, Gifford?
Yeah, the older women, their hormones are relatively stable. So the best thing we can do for this study for the young women is on day 5, where we're making those vascular measurements. We know those are sensitive to the menstrual cycle. Like, it's not a huge difference, but it's small. So we're going to make sure that we're doing that day 5 on the young women during menstruation. That's just standard practice. That's when the hormones of the young women will be closest to those of the older women. But like with the critical power stuff, that's going to take us a couple of weeks, like a week or so. So we can't really do it over
one
like,
defined period of
Yeah.
That's a limitation that I don't know how to get around at this point.
You could recruit women on birth control.
That's true.
I'm just falling here. I think maybe just dealing with the limitation is probably the better route. That's good. You thought that through. Good job.
Yeah.
This is why we're hoping Jessica Lindy's study shows no effect.
There's no thanks. Yeah.
Otherwise, research gets very complicated.
My qualm with that, though, is that everyone always says you have to control for the menstrual cycle. So if there's no difference, why are we controlling for the menstrual cycle?
Yeah. Or going a step further, there was this nice crosstalk recently where someone was in favor of controlling for menstrual cycle, always measuring at the same point in the menstrual cycle. Someone was against it. If you're always measuring at the same point in the menstrual cycle, you're just looking at women on 1 week out of 4 of their whole month. So you can justify saying by not controlling for the menstrual cycle, we're really getting an idea of what the woman looks like on average throughout the month, not just when they look most like a man, which is usually when they do the cycle testing during menstruation when hormones are lowest.
Do you know if atherosclerosis affects vascular function? I would suppose it does. And are
Yeah.
older people like, so as you age, I would suspect that the older people are always going to be a little bit more atherosclerotic compared to the younger people. So does that affect, you're measuring from the femoral artery, right? That's where your primary measure of blood flow. Does that artery get atherosclerotic? And does that then affect is that one of the primary things that affects vascular function or decreases vascular function in older people?
So I'm not sure about whether it is like common to get atherosclerosis in the femoral artery. As far as I am aware, it's not, because it's one of the larger arteries.
Right at the split, the bifurcation, if you get an older smoker, you can see some clots. It's pretty cool, actually. It looks like a clogged pipe, but it's usually right at the bifurcation or the split.
Okay.
So, yeah,
And we're scanning above the bifurcation.
So you don't expect that to be one of the primary determinants of decreased vascular function in the older people compared to the young?
Ooh.
So I was wondering that same thing. I mean, your only control is no cardiovascular medications, right? That's the only thing you're kind of hoping to control from extensive atherosclerosis, or right?
Yeah, it's an interesting thought.
Yeah, so I think because we will be looking at that, but we also are looking at the oxygenation in the muscle. So like how much oxygen is actually getting into the muscle from the blood. So I think those are probably the two that we're looking at. But yeah, I would say that blood flow is probably the main thing that we're looking at.
In terms of like with Rob's question about atherosclerosis affecting vascular function, it becomes a chicken or the egg. And really, it's the vascular function that goes first, about 10, 15 years before you see any plaques. So like if the endothelium is junky in a person, that would then lead them to having atherosclerosis. It's the first step. So definitely we'll see, because we're going to see vascular dysfunction, they're at higher risk for atherosclerosis. But then if you get like a major clot, let's say like it's 35 or 85% occluded or something like that. Yeah, now I don't know if we're making a fair comparison or not. So maybe we make an exclusion criteria if there's like a massive plaque in the artery, that we exclude them.
So you could screen for that, right? So you could actually see and
yeah, like if it's not super common, especially if they're not smokers. But if right where we're scanning, you could see a pretty big plaque. I've only seen it maybe 5 times out of the 500, 600 people I've scanned like that. So,
and I think too, because we're going to be looking at non-sedentary older adults, that it'll be less common.
yeah.
Right.
But that would definitely, like, let's say it got to the extent of peripheral arterial disease where the plaque is really big. That's really going to impair muscle blood flow. And they'll deoxygenate. Critical power should be really low. They'll fatigue really fast. So
Would that show up under like a cardiorespiratory issue or like cardiovascular medication?
Yeah, so we're going to screen for all of that. That's part of the questionnaire. But there are some people where
it's not diagnosed yet.
Not diagnosed, and we'll see, like so when you're doing an ultrasound, if you just see like a big, it almost looks like a big booger in the artery. If you see that, then we should consider excluding them, or at least noting it.
Yeah.
Collect the data, and then we'll just say these are people with really bad plaques to see if it makes it worse. That's a really good point.
Yeah.
I have one question for you. This is more of a comps question, but since you showed it, If you can go to that netter slide with where you showed leg strength per muscle mass. The last one before your methods. So
Give me just a second.
right there.
Oh, this one?
Yes.
Oh yeah, this one. Yeah.
On the left, they're showing like knee extension torque or peak force, basically, divided by muscle mass. So what is this slide telling you? When you're dividing by muscle mass, the force is still down in the old.
So that would show you that your muscle, so when you're looking at muscle or leg strength divided by muscle mass, you're looking at like strength per muscle mass. So basically, I would think that, so basically you have less strength for the same amount of muscle mass. But I would think that that would be related to fiber type, right? With aging, I actually have a slide on this. With aging, you see a transition. So in these two pictures, the A figure is the young and the B figure is the old. You see a transition from type 2 fibers to type 1 fibers with aging. And so that would decrease your leg strength.
Okay. Yeah, that's a good point. You also might see some kind of neural stuff going on too, which and I wish, like, if in follow-up studies, maybe we'll get to the point where we're measuring some like voluntary activation and stuff.
Yeah. Well, and that is something in this paper, the Di Stefano paper, they talk about how type 2 motor units die with aging, and then sometimes the type 2 fibers are innervated by other type 1 motor units and convert them more towards type 1. But sometimes they're also infiltrated with fat. So I would imagine that there is like a decrease in that neural function as well.
Okay.
Have those neurons dying.
Great. And then the last thing I want to bring up is that recruitment is probably the hardest part of this. So make sure that you talk to Nani about getting on that university email, figure that out. And then we'll also, once we get approved, we can put flyers at bike shops and stuff like that.
Yeah.
I was riding my bike up to Squaw Peak this weekend, and I was dying going up that. And I'm coming back down and I'm feeling really good. And then there's like 5 or 6 70-year-olds cruising up it on normal bikes. Those are the people we need.
Yeah.
You got to get their friends. They're out there.
Yeah.
Okay. You should have recruited them, Jason.
I know. I should have pulled them over. But it's right on that stinking incline, so nobody wants to stop.
Yeah.
Maybe I'll put a flyer right at the top.
At the top of
Sundance.
Congratulations, you made it.
You're part of our study.
Okay. Are there any more questions or suggestions for Olivia or me? We appreciate your feedback on this.
I just had one about the recruiting. Are you planning to ask your young females that menstrual, just showed like a slide with her menstrual questionnaire thing, just different questions about their periods?
So the only thing that I know of that we're like looking to control for with the menstrual cycle is when we're testing their visit 5 stuff, and we're just wanting to have that between days 1 and 7 of their menstrual cycle.
Gotcha. Well, I was just thinking, because we've had lots of subjects that wanted to move their testing around because they were just getting their period, so you don't feel very good sometimes. So I was just thinking that's probably something you should feel out with them in the informed consent, just so you know they're not gonna cancel on you.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Really, they
Yeah,
didn't
just-
want to do it, Nani.
There are a lot of,
Yeah.
most people I know don't like exercising during their period.
Damn,
Yeah,
I
we
know.
we had a lot of them want to move around because of their periods, so just something to consider.
Yeah.
Yeah, that is something I thought of also when I was watching Jess's presentation on Friday. I was thinking about it because I feel like I am the opposite of most people. I feel like I feel really crappy right before my period. And then as soon as it starts, I'm like, okay, let's exercise all day, every day. But I'm also hoping that I know most people, it's like the first few days they feel crappy. And then I'm thinking hopefully by the end of day 7, we'll be able to get them in.
Right.
They won't feel
That's a good
that's
point.
terrible. But
Maybe if they really hate the period, we can get them on like day 4 or something. The hormones will still be low. That's what we care about.
yeah, but there won't be
And it's
as much.
just estrogen and progesterone that
Yeah,
you're
those are our
looking
main
at.
ones. Yeah.
Okay, yeah, because I was thinking like the testosterone would be higher in the like after the period, right? Like the later follicular,
Yeah.
so that affect their performance. But okay, thanks, Abby.
Mhm.
Now you understand why people didn't include women in research for so long.
Yeah, I know. Mo and I were talking about that.
No, I'm interested to know what Brandon wants to do on his project with the menstrual cycle. Completely unrelated to this, but
Yeah.
okay. So committee, do you want to dismiss everyone to discuss things in private, or are you okay to make a call now?
I'm okay.
I can make a call now.
Okay. What do you guys say?
Thumbs up.
Okay, me too. I think we're good to proceed. So if you could get onto the grad progress tracker online and Marker is passing the proposal. I can put the link to that in the chat.
I need to do that for Jessica Lindy too. I think I can do that one. Yeah. Good job, Abby.
Yeah, I'm
Thank
hoping
you.
this will
Yeah, good job.
Good
this
job,
is
Abby.
going to help us
Pretty
know what to
stressed.
target when we do the heating study for the old people, so we
Yeah.
can only measure the things that are most influential.
Right.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you, everyone. We will dismiss.
All
Good
right.
job,
Hey,
Abigail.
Thanks.
hey, Jason, can I ask you a quick question while you're on here?
Yeah, yeah.
So that